Good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Kasia, Professor Jagodzinska, and to all of our guests and colleagues. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. We may be joined by a couple of other people, so I'll have the pleasure of doing the introductions and getting started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Excellent.
And it looks as if we have a few other people joining. I think in the interest of respecting our local host country, Switzerland, I'll be at 6:30 as I hear the church bells chiming across the way. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Will McDonald, and I'm the Director of Admissions and Enrollment at Webster University, Geneva. I'll introduce tonight's speaker just momentarily. First, just a background, tonight's event is the second in an ongoing webinar series on digital marketing, hosted by faculty of the Walker School of Business and Technology here at Webster University, Geneva. Each of these sessions in the series are delivered by instructors who will be presenting in our forthcoming graduate certificate in digital marketing management, which is set to begin in January 2021. So in terms of some practical logistics for this evening, as I see some additional guests arriving, I'll invite all of you to, perhaps during the presentation, all of our guests to put yourselves on mute, just so we don't have any disturbances or feedback during the first part of the presentation. And then when our presenter opens the floor, you can just unmute yourself or type questions in the chat in this chat session. Which brings me to our guest speaker this evening. Tonight, we're joined by my esteemed colleague, Professor Kasia Jagodzinska. She's the Director of Executive Education here at Webster University, Geneva, and on faculty, teaching on topics ranging from communications and negotiations to various aspects of organizational behavior. Kasia tonight will present and perhaps invite some question and answers to follow on the topic of perception management and the selfie generation. So perhaps next I will put myself on mute and I'll mute my microphone. I'll invite all of you to do the same for the first part of the presentation. And Professor Kasia Jagodzinska, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Will. It's my pleasure to be the speaker in the second series of our summer edition of the digital marketing webinars. Today, we're going to be talking about perception management, what we can learn from what people are posting online, how that impacts, and we'll make a transition towards how that may be put to more, I would say, more efficient means other than just the eye-pleasing effect and likability and gaining popular likes and so on and becoming popular on the internet. So we're going to start with perception. We're going to start with the modern technologies that we all know and so on. And then we're going to, I'm going to talk about the perception process, how that works, and what are the elements of the perception process. And then we'll show you a few chosen images which relate to perception management and some things that sometimes are staged to create a specific impression or a specific image of oneself that one wants to convey on a wider scale. And then a few techniques of impression management. This should take around 40 to 45 minutes, I would assume, of me presenting the concept, which will open the floor for any questions that you might have, and we'll close the session in about an hour from around 7:30. We'll see how it goes. So let's start. I'm going to share the document with you now. So just a second. There we go. What you should see is the title, Perception Management and the Selfie Generation. Is that what we see, Will?
Yes, thank you. It's great.
Amazing. So the selfie generation. Now, how did I come up with that term? This term appears in the book that I've recently written. It depicts a generation of people who are concentrated on conveying their image, posting obviously pictures, the so-called selfies of themselves, that convey the image basically that they want to express. So a generation oriented towards oneself. Now, my question was, watching all those people while traveling, training executives, teaching students, and so on, watching those people whose insignia is the selfie stick very often, I asked myself the question, so how can we use this to enhance our knowledge in business and to impact, understand people? Because fundamentally business and perception management are linked together. So how can we use that to understanding what are the underlying needs and interests of the population, of the people that we see around us? And that's the core of what I would like to convey today. So how can we equip ourselves with this profiling knowledge that people so willingly, although it's very often it's staged, but the staging also tells us a certain story. The staging itself has a message that on one hand is the deliberate message, the explicit one, but there is usually a second layer behind that we're going to be looking at and understanding. So what is it about the selfie generation? What are we really trying to convey here? So Jung said, and I quite like this, is the only reality. I agree with that. So each of us sees the world through his or her own lens. So we react accordingly. We identify and react to certain external triggers in a particular way. By particular way, I mean that we're primed by our experiences, our cultural sensitivity, our international exposure, our upbringing, our education level, social status, and so on, even mental state or health state that we're in, it will all impact the elements in reality that we will pay attention to. So anyone dealing with people and talking about perception management fundamentally must first understand what is the paradigm through which the other person sees the world. Very often in business transactions, what we see as one of the mistakes that are being made and why disagreements happen, why conflicts happen, why it's difficult to maximize the benefits from human interactions is that each of us has this propensity towards looking at the world through our perspective and using arguments that ultimately convince yourself and your own ego and so on. Very often you see this when people write either books or students write essays and so on. You can see clearly, of course, they know the topic, they know from their perspective what they're talking about, but it's clear that they're talking from their perspective, from someone who knows the topic very well. I'm talking strictly from my own recent experience. Again, I'm going to be referencing this book that I wrote in the sense that when I was getting reviews, I got 3 reviews, and one of the comments that was repeated in all the 3 reviews actually was that change the sequence, because you're using concepts that to someone who is not an expert or specialist in the area will not understand. And for me, it was clear that what I'm talking about. And that made me realize I speak about perception management on a regular basis, but do I necessarily walk the talk in how I write and so on? So this is another perspective on what perception and management of that means, and understanding what is the reality of the other person. Now, perception is the process by which the individual selects, organizes, interprets, and responds to information. So you'll see that there's an image of a dog and in mirrors, and you might wonder, okay, weird choice of image to describe the perception process. So allow me to enlighten you with a story. There was an experiment done with two dogs that included two dogs. Two dogs in a room and a few researchers that were observing and interpreting the results of this experiment. The experiment went as follows. First, one dog was led into a room. The first dog only, the second was waiting outside of the room. 30 seconds passed. The dog was let out of the room. The dog came out all happy. You know how happy dogs are, wagging their tails and bright eyes, and you can see they're almost smiling in human terms. The second dog was let in. 30 seconds later, the dog was let out of the same room. Mind you, in between, nothing changed in the room setting. And this second dog left the room angry, irritated, growling, tail between the legs, and so on. So all the signs of distress, of irritation, and emotional distress in general. Now the researchers asked themselves the question, since no one else was in that room, and both dogs had completely different reactions, what is the mystery behind those doors? They open the doors and what they see is a room full of mirrors. Mirrors on the floor, mirrors on the ceiling, mirrors all around. So the happy dog saw happy dogs all around and became happier or more happy. The angry dog became more and more distressed as he saw the reflection of so-called angry dogs around him. Therefore, what you display in terms of your inner stability, your emotional state at a given moment, your approach reflects back on you. So this is quite an interesting lesson, and I've seen it very often in business transactions, in business meetings as well. There's a reason why we say leave your private door, leave your private life at the door before you enter the meeting. This means that your emotional state should not impact, if possible, obviously, should not impact on the other person and should not imprint on the other person. Now, this has practical implications. So, for example, if you look at hardcore transactions, by hardcore, I mean life or death negotiations, the FBI toolkit or the framework for choice of negotiator for life and death negotiations has a very detailed framework on who is actually perceived as a legitimate negotiator, who can be perceived as, who can be appointed, not perceived, but who can be appointed and act as a legitimate negotiator in the process. And you will see that it's so detailed that it even regulates family affairs. So to the point that it cannot be someone who is undergoing a divorce, recently had a baby or is pregnant, is building a house even. Obviously someone who is addicted to drugs or alcohol or any other substances that create addiction and so on. It makes sense because all these states, all these personal inclinations, I would say, or events that impact you will have an impact on your emotional state as well. And it's a fact, if we look at the brain structure, that we cannot be at the same time both rational and emotional. So it's either reason or emotions, looking at the brain structure. So here is what happens when the perceptual process kicks in, when we've got the perceptual trigger that enters the brain. So the external, someone says something, does something, you perceive a particular situation, you observe it, you perceptually select what you want to concentrate on. This is a link to the notion of selective screening. So this means blocking out all the information that is not necessary. Then you perceptually organize, and based on that organization, you have a particular interpretation, which may be tainted also by your life experiences. I will be looking at the so-called reality as a trainer or as a professor in a different way than a student will be looking at particular events, simply because we're trained to see a little bit more and so on. And then an appropriate response will follow in relation to that. So here's a few images of what we see very often. Snapchat, sharing real life moments at the moment when they happen. Then we've got Instagram also, obviously, where we try to showcase or show off our best image of ourselves. Basically, we assess very often our own value, which becomes an addictive exercise to some people by the number of likes that we get from other people. And this has much larger implications than just the mental addiction to ego flattering or the flattering of one's own image. It can create people, it can make stars out of people. It can have serious implications for becoming famous, opening up businesses, actually making money, and so on. And we all know those success stories behind that. Studies show, research confirms that the anxiety level, the level of endorphins as well rises dramatically when we post something, when we post a picture of ourselves and so on. If we were actually connected to a machine that was checking our pulse and our blood pressure, you'd see that the blood pressure levels are elevated. There's a lot more endorphins and so on, and a lot more testosterone as well, which is very often seen as the hormone that is related to more risk-taking behaviors, more confidence, and so on. So this is an interesting fact. That's why that cocktail of hormones creates an addictive feature. I know on my own example that anytime I post something on LinkedIn, I don't post my pictures. Students very often ask, so do you have an Instagram account and so on? No, I don't, and I will explain the reason why I don't. When I post on LinkedIn, which is the professional website, then I also caught myself very often checking out how many views did the post have, where are the viewers coming from. It's fascinating as a process. So now we understand a little bit what creates this fascination. Now, the reason some business professionals choose not to post their pictures is exactly because they are trying to create a certain image, which is usually an image that is that you're trying to keep your private life private. I always repeat this: be careful what you post online, because anytime that a serious recruiter is, for example, looking at candidate profile, they will check out everything. So even if you think that your account is private, obviously there are ways to access through mutual connections, mutual friends, someone knowing someone that has access to that. And of course, it goes very easily. So I would say that privacy in that matter, I don't want to be too blank about it, but I would be careful about what is considered as keeping a private account. Then we've got some more applications, and we've got the newer ones, the one that became very popular now during the pandemic, TikTok and so on, which primarily is for people displaying a little bit more of creativity than just posting pictures of themselves and of their of certain lifestyles or certain images that they want to convey, very often artificially crafted, which we could have a more elevated discussion on what that causes, for example, to teenage viewers, how that will impact their view of the world and reality. Very often it causes a lot of distress because you're trying to keep up with the standards of beauty and so on and so on. Thinking outside the box. So this concept, the TikTok aims to think a little bit outside the box, so adding this element of creativity. Every time I hear my executives or students say, think outside the box, well, I ask myself the question, well, what is in the box, first of all? So if I'm supposed to think outside, what is in the box? In the box are fundamental psychological processes that we need to understand in order to go beyond that. So today, hopefully, I will show you some of the tools, some of the techniques, some of the perception and impression management bias and error that can occur in that box, and how to step outside of that box actually when we assess and we react to reality. So here are some common perceptual errors that one must absolutely be aware of, especially when functioning in such an international and global business environment, business, personal, entertainment, and so on. So perceptual accuracy is the first thing. Here, very often what we talk about is either the similarity error or the contrast error. So the propensity of people to assess the other person based on certain traits that are either perceived as similar or simply contrasting to ours, and then reacting accordingly. Reciprocity and similarity principles are one of the fundamental and universal human principles. So we all try to find when we bond, when we create a link with people, with other business professionals, with friends, with colleagues in our social networks and so on, we always try to find a link of an element of similarity between people. Don't let that universal principle cloud your thinking as well. Now, then we have overweighing of negative info, so negative information, or same thing, which can be also overweighing of positive. So that would refer to, I will talk about the halo effect. Obviously, any type of bias that allows you to be governed by your perception and your interpretation of reality. If you allow yourself to be governed by bias or stereotypes, very dangerous in today's world, because there's no box anymore. Okay, so if we think outside the box. So don't look at the world through the lens of basically the only thing that you can see, your bias or your stereotypes. I remember a situation that I had at the institute, not our institute, another university, where we had a team gathering, and one of the participants, one of our colleagues from the institute, we were having an informal get together to bond with the team and so on. So typical social event after work and so on. And one of the colleagues who joined us recently back then made a very stereotypical comment related to drinking and certain cultures. And I allowed myself to make a remark back to him that related to the male conducts of behaviors that are stereotypical as well for his culture. And I said, if you relate to stereotypes, then here is a stereotype and it's harmful, I understand. And I found that quite dangerous, especially at a university level, that we can allow professors who, again, he's gone by now, so I can now be telling this story because it doesn't impact his image. However, that was one of the elements. We cannot allow ourselves in our generation to raise generations of people who operate through bias or stereotypes. It's very dangerous, and very often it's harmful. And even if you look at research as well, if you look at, for example, Hall's low and high context cultures, if you look at Hofstede's cultural dimensions, you'll see that some countries, very often students will say when they do research, or executives when they do research, they will say, I can't find the country. Is it low or is it high context culture? Which dimension is it on? Very often the reason is because it's in the middle, because we're changing the internationalization, globalization process is impacting human resources, and it's impacting the changes of the flavor of the type of culture that we're dealing with. Moving on, perceptual defense, hearing what we want to hear. very dangerous for performance reviews, for example. So overweighing of the positive or the negative information, stereotypes, I already concentrated on that. The halo effect, I like this very much. The halo effect is when you create a positive image, like a halo for an angel, and you allow that positive image that you've created will impact the way the other people see you. So for example, some students or some employees will create a very strong first impression of a very good students, try in the first semester and so on in the first year, and then slip and slide a little bit in the second year, let's say. But they already have the halo effect going on for them. So the professors will usually say, well, this is perplexing. This student had such good grades. There must be something wrong, and so on. So very often you're assessed still in the positive matter, whereas the results no longer follow. So this works the other way around too. So you can't continue in that trend too long. What I find very interesting in managerial terms and in perception management is the Pygmalion and the Golem effect, Golem effects relates to when you have low expectations of yourself or your team. And very often, this is what we call in perception management, the set up to fail syndrome. So very often, because I have low expectations, so for example, I'm tainted or I'm primed by a difficult client or a difficult transaction or a difficult negotiation. Let's say I'm sending my assistant or my student on a mission and I say, this is a very difficult project. Then this person will already be primed in the sense that difficult, then it may be that I will not succeed. Same thing, same logic in contrast to that is the Pygmalion. High expectations yield high results. I was raised in the way that for my parents, maybe they placed their ambitions, maybe is an understatement. They placed a lot of their ambitions in my performance, but I've never heard that this something is too difficult. Everything was always easy. And I approached many things that were objectively speaking quite difficult, but I was looking through the lens, well, it's all a piece of cake. So now this is also what I'm trying to do. I never allow myself, for example, when I give executive trainings, to get into that office gossip, this is a difficult client. Because in negotiation, for example, we know that the moment you label, and that's perception management, labeling is one of those elements. The moment you label, that's the moment that the client has become 100% as difficult because you're seeing that person or that situation as difficult. Projection is seeing one's own traits in the other person. So that's a little bit similar to what we talked about in relation to perceptual accuracy, so similarity error. And impression management is an attempt to control or manipulate the impression that one makes. And I'll show you examples of what that manipulation means here. This is perhaps not yet pure impression management. Some of you have, I'm sure, have seen this exercise in perception management, which is the mental maps, the phenomena of mental maps and paradigm shift. The way this works is you divide the audience into two groups. One group is shown the image of what you see now in front of you, which is an image of a young woman. Second half of the audience or the research population is presented with an image of the old woman that you see now. And then it takes only 30 seconds, this experiment. So you look at around the time that I allowed you to look at both. And then you show both. This is an image actually that depicts both the old and the young. For those who have not seen this, 60% of the population very often have difficulty seeing both the old and the young woman in the image because they've been primed. Think about it. 30 seconds of priming by these mental maps, and you have a difficulty with seeing both, with doing what is called the paradigm shift. That's the aha moment when I can see both images, the young and the old one, in one. That's what we call the paradigm shift. Think of it like this: a mental map of 30 seconds can prime people to seeing the world in a specific way. Think of what a lifetime of education, upbringing, family traditions, national cultures, corporate cultures, international exposure, and any other life experiences that life may deal with you or hand you out and so on, what that will do to your mental mapping. So we all see that's a very strong tool in perception management. And the way this works, the challenge for us functioning in a global environment, interacting with other people, is to understand how you see, through which lens are you looking at the world, and be able to do that paradigm shift accordingly. Impression management, there we go. We've got a few interesting elements here. So we've got the Polish president and the president of the US. Trump will appear on two slides, not because I'm a supporter, but because it's such a gracious persona for impression management and looking at certain displays and attributes of power and status. Look at this image of our president, who is signing an agreement, looking happy as a schoolboy, signing the agreement, leaning in, and so on. Look at, I'm not going to go into political and so on. I'm just going to pay attention and direct your attention towards impression management. I'm not going to be talking about the political background or what this means, what are the implications and so on. That is beyond the scope of this webinar. I only want to pay your attention and direct your attention towards status and attributes of power. So here you've got the clear, in body language, you've got the clear imbalance and creation of power by the body language, by the fact that a president does not have a chair, and so on and so on. Some people would say, well, he's towering over the other one. Not necessarily in this case, because he's not fully standing. He's not in a comfortable position in that regard, which creates an image of, I would say, as already stated, imbalance of power, which the reason we're talking about this, because it creates a certain image internationally. This was hugely commented, for example, by the Polish citizens. This was actually this caused a lot of criticisms and so on. So this has larger implications on the perceived image of the person. Here, mind you, in China and US, we've got, look at the hands, please. So the hands are the element, excuse me, that is important for me here. In American culture, in terms of attributes of power, status, and so on, there's a whole framework of how to shake hands. So whose hand is the one that is dominating? So whose palm is specifically, when there are pictures being taken, which is the one that is overtaking the other one? And we can clearly see that in the picture here, which may be staged. Maybe it was not a deliberate effort. My personal opinion is that it probably was. However, nonetheless, you can see that as well. And here, what some of you may notice or may not notice when you look at the picture on the left of Macron, you'll see that he has. At first, it was difficult for me to see that image, is just to find the two iPhones that are that he has next to him. So if you look on the left hand side, he has two iPhones, one on top of each other, which may be perceived as, I have more information or access to more information directly at my fingertips, literally, than the other party, and so on. So very often we'll see that in difficult negotiations, what I've seen time and time again, when we enter the negotiation room, for example, and people play with impression management tactics, they have two laptops open, or even three laptops, three computers. Very often my executives will say, bring in all the laptops that we have and put them on my desk. because people inevitably perceive this as, wow, you have access to power. I've heard executives say and interpret. I made a picture of one such scene, and then I showed it to some executives, and it did create fear. They said perhaps they even have information on me, something I don't know about, simply because they have 3 laptops. So this is how, by small means, you can create an impression of basically of anxiety on the part of the other person, or a more favorable image of yourself. We're going to close the session since it's 5 minutes past. I'll close soon, but I want to tell you about some impression management techniques, the ones that I can equip you with in such a small time frame. First of all, use what I call the spectator event in impression management. So we've spoken about the common perception errors. We talked about the dangers of some of the biases, stereotypes. We talked about the phenomena of mental maps and paradigm shift, which is that moment when you see the big picture. We talked about how the perception process works in general. The spectator effect means distance yourself and see yourself, not look at yourself as if you were looking at yourself on the selfie that you make in a given situation. So distance yourself, become the viewer, the spectator, rather than the person who is implicated in a given situation, to minimize this risk of emotions versus rational, so the emotions taking over when we think about the interpretation and response to the perceptual trigger. Think of room design. So I showed you a few images of room design. I gave you examples: 2 laptops, 3 laptops, 2 iPhones, room design, 1 chair, only for 1 president, the other one has to be leaning on the desk to sign an agreement, and so on. So think how room design will convey the image as well. Very often what we see in the background, now I put also virtual room design, because ultimately you create a certain perception that you want to make. Anything that you look at long enough becomes legitimate. And that's the psychological theory behind subconscious external triggers that enter the mind, that it becomes you accept it. I've seen it in negotiations. I've seen it with parties coming equipped with either contracts or stating their demands or terms on the whiteboard or the flip chart, and then the terms being accepted simply because they were in the background, they became as part of the reality, and so on. Then mirror, mirror on the wall. Remember the story of the dogs, because this is what we're going to finish my presentation with. So next time when you look at selfies, try to identify, what is this person really trying to convey? What am I trying to convey? What do people see in the background? Sometimes there are rather unfortunate shots that we think this is a great picture, we post it and so on, and then we realize when we at second glance that either it shows something that is not flattering to our professional status or the effect that we wanted to show, or people can look too much into. This is also the danger of virtual rooms and now us working in virtual reality, especially in virtual negotiations. In negotiations, we talk about that you never know who is in the room. So you never know how many negotiators or how many parties, or if you're recording, who's going to have access to that recording, who's going to a selfie posted at 3 a.m. that will resonate quite well with my students. I would assume that a selfie posted at 3 or 4 a.m. on a Friday night may look very entertaining at that point, but may look completely different when you wake up the next day on Saturday and you take a look at it again, and that stays forever, and that impacts, unfortunately, your image. So I would say be careful with that. Then power posing and inner presence. So we saw some power poses. We saw the hand that is on the, that my hand is the one that is prevailing, or I'm the one that is going to be sitting in. Very often in meetings with people, it can even come to the point where people play around with the height of their chairs. So you're sitting lower than me, you're in the less powerful position, and so on. And inner presence. The reason that I'm presenting and I chose this topic is that power is an elusive concept. So we said that perception is the only realities. Power is an elusive concept in the same way. Either you think you have it and then you have it. If you think you don't have it, then for sure you don't have it. So it all starts with that, what we're trying to convey. And I believe that if we're capable of posting the best image of ourselves, we're capable also of taking the best snapshot internally of ourselves and trying to allow us for that image, that perfect image that we want to convey, to drive our interactions in business and other situations and beyond. And then pay attention to status and symbols of power. I was in a training earlier today, and we were talking about, one of the participants made a remark saying that obviously this person is ego driven. And that caught my attention. And I said, well, then what are the displays of the ego that you can see? And the person started enumerating status symbols, fancy cars, equipment, latest technology and devices, and things that can be perceived as belonging to a person who is in the position, first of all, to afford them, and then second of all, that very often we attribute to certain elements of achievement or power and so on. The question that was raised was, how do you achieve for those people the same effect in virtual reality? Very often this is what is happening on the subconscious level. So we play around with that, creating a certain image. But how are we going to display that in virtual reality? That's the question that you can all think about. And then finally, leading us to the last slide, we started with the story about the two dogs. The world is a mirror. So what you display resonates back to you, and the impression that you want to make and that you want to convey will resonate, and people will react accordingly to that image. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kasia. I appreciated very much some of those visuals. It helps us to imagine some of the concepts that might be very often harder to understand, given that they're elements that really are intersectional, cross-sectional between aspects of psychology, even some visual semiotics. I invite the floor. I open the floor up for questions at this point. If anyone would like to either unmute or type a question, we'd be happy for Kasia to address questions you may have at this time.
I have a question.
Speaking. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yes. But, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation, which I think is more for the students of management who want to run businesses or be in a key position, and how they should impress their counterparts in negotiation process to get something into their plate, investment or good deal or all that. In that case, you are right. I mean, one should show a position of strength, knowledge, and a good behavior, being sure of himself, of his knowledge, and of his communication skills. This is how to influence the other side, and how to retain the power in one's hand. That is clear for me. But as we are university professors, and we are teaching online now, and our aim is not to be so much in a power, but empower the students with knowledge. What would be your advice to online professor in terms of communicating effectively its knowledge in this environment to students to get the maximum result?
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Can you mute your microphone when I answer, because I think there's an echo? So then I'm going to mute mine as well. Sorry. So what I would do is, what I recommend is involving the students basically in the process. So having them have a say in the design of the course material, obviously in the framework of the syllabus and the academic concepts that we have to convey to them, but also making something, the projects, making them practical for the students, showing them what is the relevancy. I remember when I was a student, I always reacted most favorably to the classes where I understood how is this going to be basically useful for me in my future careers? Why am I doing this, in other words? And we're all driven by that. Any endeavor that we undertake, we ask ourselves the question, why am I doing this? Otherwise, we don't have motivation. So I would say this is my personal experience. What I try to do, I try to empower my students in the process. Very often, and you could ask them, and I'm sure they would say, she talks about her mistakes all the time. So any business situation that I have, I share with them some learnings and some insights, basically that I get from my business practice. And I learn every day. I make mistakes every day. I try to correct my behavior every day. I share that with them simply because to show them we've all done that. Obviously, it's not possible. My mom said once to me, learn on my mistakes. Impossible. Okay, but if you listen to enough of that, maybe something will rub off on you, and so on. So empowerment and relevancy, and involving the other party, students, not a student, you're the person you're dealing with, simply in the process, I think is a mixture that works quite well, hopefully.
I'd like to build upon what Ruben said. Ruben, also marketing people need to understand perception. Let's not forget that. Because perception becomes reality. But if a company makes an error, a mistake with a product, with communication, or in negotiation, someone makes an error, how does one go about effectively correcting and repairing the mistakes that they make, generally speaking?
Okay, so basically what happens very often, what we're talking about is typically the situation where there is an ethical dilemma. So very often it happens. Mattel had scandals like this when they introduced a batch of 20,000 or 30,000, I don't remember now, a batch of toys with toxic paint levels. And what they were facing were, okay, this is obviously a mistake. So what do we do? Do we sweep it under the carpet and say, okay, maybe some children will be intoxicated by the elevated paint levels or not, or do we come clean about it? And like this, we might risk losing some profits. However, no one will be harmed. So Mattel came clean as one of the companies that was implicated in such mistakes that happen. The trick is to damage control that, obviously to remedy the situation on the tactical aspect, but also to communicate clearly a press release, press conference. And also what is very often is not done is internal communication, which then happens for marketing reasons. What we have is a discrepancy between internal, what the employees know, and what is communicated externally. And then it leaks from the internal side. And the consumers are basically confused. What happens is that the image of the company is ruined nonetheless. So if you choose to do that press external release, make it consistent with what everybody knows in-house. And that's my recommendation as far as that question is concerned.
Hello, Professor.
Yes.
I have a little question regarding, thank you first of all for the presentation. So, regarding, the selfie generation that we are today, we have this sense of entitlement, which you said before, and research has proven that, we're living in this narcissistic period where we have this sense of entitlement, especially our generation currently. I would like to know what's your point of view, regarding, what's it called? Regarding, business meetings where we're going to have to do interviews, we're going to have to speak for our point of view, and how not to have this sense of entitlement. What's your recommendations, let's say, for our generation?
Mehdi, could you define what you mean exactly by the sense of entitlement?
Because let's say that we've been asking, we've lived in this era where we believe that as individuals we have the right for a certain amount of salary, we have the right for a certain amount of paid vacation, let's say, and which is not exactly the truth, because we're going to have to fight for what we want. And what do you have to say about this?
What I have to say, thank you for clarifying and thank you for the question. What I have to say on that topic is that obviously we, at some point, all of us, it doesn't matter the generation, I agree that the stress-free generation, or this, as you call it, the self-entitled, or I call it self-oriented as well, has this, this perceived notion of certain privileges. What my recommendation would be that you have to obviously balance the interests of both parties, and that is the recommendation that works in what you're referring to. So when you go for your first internship or job salaries and so on, there cannot be a long-standing sustainable agreement between the parties if the mutual both interests and are not met and mutually accepted by the parties. So at one point, there will have to be a bridge between that sense of entitlement, perhaps lowering the expectations a little bit, and so on. I would say that at the first phase, what will happen is there's going to be a clash between expectations and reality, which is completely normal. And then there will be the adjusting or the adopting period to the new reality. And then I always say that privileges come when you earn them. So in that sense, life teaches all of us a lesson, and there comes a time once you've earned it that you can actually feel privileged. Now, not in all interviews, because in some situations it depends. Now we're getting into details and more specifics. It depends on the type of jobs that you're applying for, because in some jobs you may want to display the fact that you can stand up for your own rights and that you are willing to show a little bit more competitive spirit in that regard. So for example, let's assume that you're being groomed or you're being trained to become a hostage negotiator. Obviously, you're not going to be negotiating your first salary the same way as you're going to be negotiating for, I would say, a less difficult or less competitive and so on position. So that is also, it can be an advantage in certain types of situations and jobs that you're applying for, to show that I can actually be a little bit more demanding in my cooperation, in my expectations and so on. To the rest, I would say, I will repeat what I said before, that privilege, the real privilege, has to be earned, and that's something that life will probably verify on its own. To that sense of entitlement will be a little bit, I would say, a little bit minimized. I hope that answers your question, Mehdi.
Much, Professor.
Thank you.
I have a quick question, if I can.
Brian, is that you? Yes, okay.
So I was just thinking about, something a lot of me and friends my age have said is, thank goodness there was no cameras when we were growing up. And so, you think about that now, this generation is growing up in a connected and social media world, but where do you see this progressing, in 10 to 20 years into the future? At first we thought, how is a person going to get elected to, let's say, the presidency in a social media world where their every dumb thought that they had when they were 18 is accessible to the world? So where do you see this, as a natural progression forward? Does it become acceptable? Does it change? Does it increase? Does it decrease? I'm just kind of getting an idea of, what do you think?
Oh, Brian, you asked me a question like that. I feel like in an interview, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I cannot, I'm not a fortune teller. So there are two options. Either everything is going to be monitored, And we see this with the COVID situation, with the monitoring already in some countries in place, that we can monitor people's movements and so on, under the pretext or actually for the purpose of controlling the spread of the epidemic. So either we're all going to be, in that sense, connected, and all our movements are going to be traced, and all our thoughts are going to be in the digital world and so on. Or there are going to be some people who will choose to disconnect, so take a detox from technology and simply choose not to. And I have already a group of friends who refuse to be on social media, to refuse to take part in that, and so on. We could add to the discussion on artificial intelligence, so how that will also impact the landscape, but obviously that's a whole different discussion. So for me, either that, but I'm extreme, so I'm always either right or left and so on. So for me, it's either going to be detox and cutting off, or everything is going to be accessible, and so on. I'm trying to limit the exposure, as I said before. I'm trying to limit it only to the professional activities and so on, not allowing too many images of myself in private settings and so on to be leaked, and to the extent also that if I go out and there happens to be when you go out sometimes to places and people take photographs and so on, I try not to be in them, because I know that such images can always be used in a different manner than what one person would probably wish to have. So that's to my capacity, that's how I can answer that question.
Brian, it's an interesting question, and just to connect back to the point, or perhaps it was the point that Ron was making or asking Kasia about, when we look at the, how does a company repair damage in a either an ethical crisis, as Kasia referred to, or damage among customers and so forth. There's a personal level, as Brian's just asked about, as well as a corporate level, perhaps, or organizational level, on reputation management. And I think it really brings up the idea that in a digital world, a selfie world where everyone has the camera, everyone has access, the risks are very high in terms of potential exposure for reputation. Perhaps the caveat, Kasia, I don't know if you or even Ron want to comment on that. The flip side of that is that while there's more risks for either an individual or a company, there's also maybe more opportunities to be aware of what your customers are thinking. In the past, many companies were spending surveys after phone surveys after all sorts of market research to try to discover what it is the customers are thinking and feeling about product or service. And now you find out instantly whether you ask or not. So I guess that's maybe more of a comment, but just to tie it together, it seems that there are both reputation management risks and opportunities that come from being in such a digitized world.
Definitely. However, some consumers, when they find out that their consumer taste or preferences have been identified in that manner, irrevocably choose not to buy products from specific supermarkets and so on, because they can anticipate based on, very often they can anticipate. There was this study that your supermarket knows that you're pregnant before you actually say it to the world, because women, they follow trends, they follow the usual what your grocery list is, and they have access to your private life in a way that is obviously very intrusive. And then it seems randomly that they start sending you more ads or products related to pregnancy, babies, and so on and so on. So that was quite actually a well-known case of consumers being, their private lives being invaded and surveyed in that sense. So it can have that sword has both ends as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree. My students or former students will know what I'm about to say. From a marketing point of view, I'd like to say that I think it's a great tool for marketing companies to use to understand what their customers want and need, and then they can deliver that. We're getting to the point where we're able to identify individual wants and needs of our customers and deliver that. Therefore, we're not wasting a lot of marketing resources, excuse me, and time, and we're being more effective with our consumers, giving them what they want to see. So, but on the other hand, you've got the privacy issues. So I really think it's up to the individual to determine how much they want to give away. You know, some of us here are willing to open the book and say, "Here I am." You know, advertise to me. I'm willing to take a look at things. And there are some of us here that are saying, "Keep me out of this. I'm not. I'll make my own decision later." So it's. I think the jury is still out on which way to go. Maybe Ed Boon has a. On this.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if he picked up on the cue that you had there, Ron.
Edward, if you want to comment on what I just said, I welcome your comments. Anyway, that's my thought.
While he's thinking, we may have just. It looks like maybe one more minute. If there's a burning question among the audience there, please feel free to chime in. Last opportunity. Okay, perhaps then I think we'll slowly begin to wrap up, just in the interest of keeping time as we promised to 1 hour. I want to thank you, Kasia, for the presentation and some thought-provoking ideas and images, and also to thank the participants for joining us this evening. If you're interested in these kinds of topics, we encourage you to return. We have other events in this series. Next will be next Wednesday evening, June 17th, same time at 6:30 p.m. on digital trends for 2020 and beyond. That's Professor Dr. Nicoletta Jacobacci, who's going to speak on emerging media, including new media formats, transmedia technologies, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, and so on. So we look forward to seeing you again at the next event online. And also, we certainly remain available if you have any interest in these topics regarding formal learning through the university. Kasia, the Director of Executive Education, who presented this evening, and other faculty are available to answer questions. We'll continue to update the website, especially as the months progress, we get closer to the launch of the new certificate. So thank you very much once again for joining us on behalf of Webster University Geneva. I wish you a pleasant evening, and hopefully as we begin to deconfine, we hope the rest of you are doing the same, regardless of where you may be joining from. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much to everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Kasia. Great job last night or yesterday.
Have a good evening, Professor.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.